Their envy and jealousy was beyond evil.
The consciousness is beginning to gradually spread with the wind. Blacks are beginning to stir up, questioning outrightly, burdened by hurting memories passed down to them from older generations who were present in the horrible event of the destruction of these prosperous cities. More horrible than words it is.
And they say black people never try to get ahead? Black people aren't entrepreneurial? We were the original entrepreneurs before all of the other immigrant groups.
My grandmother is from Thomasville, Arkansas. Her town was destroyed when she was a kid, and she had PTSD from it until she passed away at the age of 88 in 2010.
What I don't understand, they didn't want us to integrate their neighborhoods. Then why destroy the neighborhoods that we built?
I met the survivors of the Philadelphia destruction 9 years back in 1998, and they were still shell-shocked.
In the shadow of America's troubled past, a sinister force fueled the destruction of thriving black communities. Hate, segregation, and racism had ignited a fire of envy, targeting self-sufficient black towns and cities. The result was devastating. Once vibrant neighborhoods reduced to ghost towns in a wink of an eye. Their stories silenced by violence and oppression. Welcome to another video segment where we continue the journey into one of America's darkest histories of black ghost towns, which were erased from the American landscape by hatred and intolerance of the white dominance. Let us dive in. Number 11, Philadelphia. The Philadelphia catastrophic event, also termed the 1985 MOVE bombing, took place on May 13, 1985. On this day, the city of Philadelphia witnessed a catastrophic event that left an indelible mark on its history. The MOVE organization, a black liberation group, had been occupying a row house in West Philadelphia for years. The group's very loud and public quest for racial justice, as well as its strong views on animal rights, led to a number of confrontations between MOVE members and their West Philadelphia neighbors, as well as with Philadelphia police. One such confrontation was the one that happened on May 13, 1985. The Philadelphia Police Department, armed with warrants, attempted to evict the group. The situation quickly escalated, and in a shocking turn of events, a police helicopter dropped a bomb containing C4 explosive and Tovex onto the roof of the building. The resulting explosion and fire engulfed the house, trapping those inside. This incident would spark widespread outrage, calling for accountability. The city's leadership faced intense scrutiny, leading to significant changes in police department policies and procedures. However, this would not measure up to the damage done. Lives have been lost. The MOVE bombing was a horrific tragedy that claimed the lives of 6 MOVE members, including 5 children and 3 of their neighbors. One of the children who burned was a 12-year-old little Phil Africa. 7 years earlier, his 3-week-old brother had been killed after being knocked out of his mother's arms and crushed during an altercation with police. After the bombing, a fire broke out that claimed 61 surrounding buildings and left 250 people homeless in the middle-class black neighborhood. The houses that were built to replace them were tissue paper, shoddy, and the contractors tasked with replacing them served jail time for misusing the rebuilding fund. By the mid-2010s, more than half of the rebuilt homes sat boarded up, purchased by the city for $150,000 each. Number 12, Quindaro, Kansas City. In the early 20th century, Kansas City had experienced significant growth, driven by its strategic location at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers. The city became a major transportation hub, with railroads, highways, and rivers connecting it to other parts of the country. African Americans migrated to Kansas City from the rural South, seeking better economic opportunities and fleeing racial violence. They established vibrant communities, including the Quindaro neighborhood, which became a center of African American culture, commerce, and entertainment. The community also boasted a strong sense of pride and self-sufficiency, with numerous civic organizations, fraternal groups, and cultural events. Despite this progress, African Americans in Kansas City face significant challenges, including racial segregation and discrimination in housing, education, and employment, limited access to health care, social services, and government resources. These systemic issues made the community more vulnerable to the devastating impact of the 1951 flood, which ultimately destroyed the thriving Quindaro neighborhood and displaced thousands of African Americans. The flood was a devastating disaster that ravaged the city, particularly the African American community, due to the racial hatred and discriminatory practices of the white dominance. The flood was caused by a combination of heavy rainfall and the failure of the city's levee system, which was intentionally designed to protect white-owned businesses and properties while leaving the black neighborhoods vulnerable. On July 12, 1951, the Kansas River began to swell, and by July 13, the water had overflowed the levees, inundating the African American community of Quindaro, Kansas City, Kansas. The floodwaters destroyed hundreds of homes, businesses, churches, and properties, leaving thousands of people homeless and without livelihoods. The flood was not just a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe fueled by racial hatred and segregation. African Americans were forced to live in the low-lying areas, devoid of proper infrastructure and flood protection, making them easy targets for the raging floodwaters. As the waters rose, panic set in, and people scrambled to escape the deadly deluge. Many were trapped in their homes, churches, and businesses, unable to flee. The screams of those seeking help were drowned out by the roar of the floodwaters. The floodwaters ravaged the community, destroying everything in their path. Homes were reduced to rubble, businesses were washed away, and churches were left in ruins. The once thriving African American community was now a scene of utter devastation. Many perished in the disaster. Over 1,000 people were injured, and thousands more were left homeless. The floodwaters receded in July 20th, 1951, leaving behind a trail of destruction and despair. In the aftermath, African Americans faced significant barriers in accessing aid, resources, and support. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and other government agencies provided minimal assistance, leaving the community to fend for itself. The 1951 Kansas City flood was a stark reminder of the racial hatred and discrimination that African Americans faced in the United States. It was a disaster that could have been mitigated, but racial segregation and discriminatory practices made it a catastrophe. The legacy of this event continues to impact the community today, serving as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equality. 13. The city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast in August 2005, was one of the most devastating natural disasters in U.S. history. Hurricane Katrina's fury began to unfold on August 23, 2005, as a tropical depression formed in the warm waters of the Bahamas. Over the next 2 days, the storm intensified, earning its name Katrina, as it strengthened into a hurricane. On August 25th, Katrina made landfall in southern Florida, bringing heavy rain and strong winds to the region. However, it was only a glimpse of the devastation to come. As Katrina entered the Gulf of Mexico, it began to intensify, fueled by the warm waters. The storm's power grew, and its category rating increased. By August 28, Katrina had become a Category 5 hurricane, the highest rating on the Saffir-Simpson scale. On August 29th at 6:10 a.m., Katrina made landfall in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, just southeast of New Orleans. The storm's winds howled, and its storm surge crashed against the city's levee system. The levees, weakened by years of neglect and poor maintenance, began to fail. Water poured into the city, flooding homes, businesses, and streets. Panic set in as residents realized the severity of the disaster. Chaos erupted, with reports of looting, violence, and desperation. August 30 became the day of peak flooding, with waters rising to as high as 20 feet in some areas. The city was submerged, and its people were trapped. As the storm slowly moved inland, its winds weakened, but the damage was done. Katrina began to dissipate on August 31st, leaving behind a trail of destruction, death, and despair. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, the true extent of the devastation became clear. Over 1,800 lives were lost, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. Millions of people were left homeless along the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina caused approximately $161 billion in economic damage. The city of New Orleans was forever changed, its culture, economy, and people scarred by the storm's fury. You may be wondering how a natural disaster like this can be linked to racism. However, the truth is that the failure of the city's levee system, combined with the storm's powerful winds and rain, resulted in catastrophic flooding, which might have been minimal if the city's drainage systems had been working effectively. Furthermore, the slow response from government agencies was also a contributing factor. 14. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's past is marred by a tragic event in 1906, when racial animosity erupted into disruption. The violence erupted on September 22nd to September 24th, but the underlying tensions had been building for years in the post-Reconstruction era. Economic competition and resentment between African Americans and whites had been simmering, fueled by racial stereotypes and prejudices. The spark that ignited the powder keg of racial animosity was a series of false accusations of African American men assaulting white women. On September 22, 1906, a local newspaper, the Atlanta News, published sensationalized reports of alleged attacks on white women by black men, which further inflamed the already tense atmosphere. However, and a group of African American men at the 5 Points intersection in downtown Atlanta on the evening of September 22nd, the white mob, fueled by rage and misinformation, began attacking African American men and businesses, leading to a wave of violence that spread throughout the city over the next 2 days. Within a few hours, rumors had spread around the town, and white mobs quickly formed. The mobs rampaged through African American neighborhoods, attacking homes, businesses, and individuals with impunity. The streets ran red with blood as the death toll mounted. The violence was indiscriminate, with men, women, and children all falling victim to the white mob's wrath. Many more were injured, with estimates ranging from 150 to 300, their bodies battered and bruised from the relentless attacks. As the city descended into chaos, many African Americans were forced to flee for their lives, abandoning their homes and businesses in a desperate bid to escape the carnage. The streets ran red with blood, and the sounds of gunfire, screams, and shattering glass filled the air. The city's leadership failed to intervene, allowing the violence to escalate. Governor Hope Smith and Mayor Evan Howell were slow to respond, and when they finally deployed militia, the damage was already done. The rioting subsided, but the trauma lingered, leaving deep scars on the community. The investigations were half-hearted, and no one was held accountable for the atrocities. The decimation marked a turning point in Atlanta's racial dynamics, solidifying white supremacy and suppressing the progress of African Americans. Prominent black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington spoke out against the violence, but their voices were drowned out by the cacophony of racism and hatred. After the heat of the mass killing, the city was left to pick up the pieces of their broken community, their trust in the system shattered by the authorities' slow response and lack of action. In the aftermath, the city's leaders struggled to come to terms with the scale of the devastation. Official reports were sanitized, and the true extent of the violence was downplayed. But the African American community knew the truth. They had been targeted, and their lives had been forever changed by the hatred and violence that had been unleashed upon them. 15. Memphis, Tennessee. The Memphis, Tennessee annihilation was a devastating event that occurred in May 1866. It was a brutal display of racial violence perpetrated by white mobs against African Americans. The city, still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War, was a volatile mix of racial animosity, economic competition, and political unrest. On May 1st, 1866, a seemingly minor confrontation between white police officers and black soldiers sparked the violence. However, it quickly escalated into a full-blown riot as white mobs comprising of police officers, firefighters, and civilians descended upon the city's black residents, soldiers, and sympathizers. Over the next 2 days, the mobs wreaked havoc on the city, leaving a trail of destruction and death in their wake. Black churches, schools, and homes were torched, and their occupants were beaten, shot, or lynched. The streets ran red with the blood of innocent victims, as the white mobs showed no mercy in their rampage. A joint congressional committee reported 75 persons injured, 100 persons robbed, 5 women raped, 91 homes burned, 4 churches and 8 schools burned and destroyed, and $17,000 in federal property destroyed. Hundreds of blacks were jailed, and almost all other freedmen fled town until the carnage ended. For 2 days, communities. White mobs, which included policemen, firemen, and some